Hi, this is Jay Shorr, and by now you've probably seen many of our videos for the entire team. But I'm a partner in Shore Solutions, an award-winning national practice management consulting firm specializing in the operational, administrative, and financial health of medical practices. Now, by now, most of the people are probably back to work in some form, one way or another. And because of that, you may have already received, and hopefully you've received, part of the CARES Act Payroll Protection Program. Now, the SBA released its Payroll Protection Program loan forgiveness application and clarified a few critical definitions and documentation requirements in their instructions. So please allow me to give you a helping hand with this. The forgiveness application is completed by the small business borrower, meaning you, and is submitted to the bank or the lender in which you've received your payroll protection loan from. Here comes the more challenging part. The application consists of 11 lines that, when calculated, results in the amount of forgiveness that a small business owner will be eligible for. And in prior videos that we've done, we've gone over the 75-25% rule, and we'd be more than happy to go through that with you on a personal level if you need that help. So the forgiveness component of the PPP is what attracted small business owners to take out these payroll protection program loans in the first place. And they were done in droves. Many people got it on the first round. Many, unfortunately, did not. As the program promised forgiveness of amounts loaned so long as the small business used the funds for payroll, business mortgage interest, rent, and utilities. For a summary of the forgiveness, please refer to our website and other articles that we've done. Now, let me try and share that there is a three-part calculation method. The application consists of a three-part calculation to determine the amount eligible for forgiveness. First, the application asks for the payroll and qualifying non-payroll costs that the business has spent over the 8-week period of time since it received the PPP funds. Interesting. And that's what's the important part, the 8 weeks since you've received it. The second step is a reduction in the forgiveness amount if you have reduced your pay for employment greater than 25%, or if you have not brought back the same number of full-time equivalent employees. All right. So the full-time equivalent employees, we'll call that FTE rule, requires that a small business reduce its forgiveness request if it does not bring back the same number of employees that it had prior to the pandemic. Now, the application does provide for a waiver of this reduction if the business failed to bring back its same amount during that 8-week period of time, but brought them back after or by June 30th. So let me rephrase that again. If you don't bring back the same number of employees that you had pre-pandemic, the application does provide for a waiver of this reduction. If you failed to bring back the same number of employee count during its 8 weeks, but later brought them back in the same number by June 30th. Step number three. Step number three is the 75% payroll cost test, which states that the forgiveness request must be comprised of at least 75% of the payroll costs. The other 25% can only be used for rent, mortgage interest, debt, and utilities. If the forgiveness request in step number three exceeds 75%, then you will instead take the amount of your payroll costs and will divide that by a 0.75, 75%, and that will give you your total forgiveness amount. For example, if you had payroll costs of $70,000 and non-payroll costs of $30,000, assuming you had a $100,000 loan, then you would only be at 70% and would not meet the 75% rule. And the $30,000 in non-payroll costs would need to be reduced. The application calculation would be $70,000 divided by 0.75, and that would bring the total forgiveness amount to $93,333 out of the $100,000. And this calculation effectively reduces the non-payroll costs from $30,000 to $23,333. And now the forgiveness request of 75% of the payroll costs and 25% of the non-payroll costs. Now, rent included leases of personal and real property. So many small business owners and their accountants and lawyers were unclear whether the lease of personal property was an amount that could be included in the rent and thus forgiven. So the forgiveness application specifically states that rent includes the following: business rent or lease payments pursuant to lease payments for real or personal property in force before February 15th, business rent or lease payments. It was clear that rental payments for office, storefront, and other real property was going to be included, but the application now makes it clear that personal property items such as copiers, servers, autos, and other common items of personal property that are leased by a business will be includable in the bucket of non-payroll costs that may be forgiven. That's a great thing to know. And similarly, a business mortgage interest payment includes loans for real property and personal property, and as a result, the interest paid on loans for equipment, auto, and other property items are includable and can be forgiven. Utility definition includes internet, transportation, and telephone. Now look, the application also defines what utility expenses may be added to the application, and these expenses include electricity, gas, water, transportation, telephones, or internet for which service began before February 15th, 2020. Now that's a very important date to know. So most of these utility expenses are pretty straightforward, but what falls under the transportation is uncertain. So the Small Business Administration guidelines appears to define transportation costs as gas and other auto expenses that would usually be part of the auto deductions on the business tax return. Be careful. It's got to be equivalent to what would be deductible under the business tax return. Now, how do you calculate a full-time equivalent employee? In determining your full-time equivalent employee before the pandemic and during the 8-week period, the Small Business Administration has given two alternative methods of calculation. The first, that takes some math and seems complex at first, but will give flexibility and will meet the intent of the rule that those small businesses who retain or bring back all of their employees during the 8-week period or by June 30th will not have their forgiveness requested reduced. Let me repeat. The first method takes some math and seems complex at first, but will give flexibility and will meet the intent of the rule that those small businesses who retain or bring back all of their employees during the 8-week period or by June 30th will not have their forgiveness request reduced. The first option is to take the average number of hours paid each week for each employee and divide it by 40 and round that to the nearest tenth. So the maximum number of hours that per employee for a full-time equivalent would be 40 or 1 FTE, full-time equivalent. So let's run a quick example for small businesses with 3 employers. Employer 1 averages 40 hours, so 40 hours divided by 40 equals 1, and that equals 1 full-time equivalent. Employee number 2 averages 37 hours. So you take 35 divided by 40, and that gives you a 0.875. Rounded to the nearest tenth is 0.9. So that's 0.9 of a full-time equivalent. Gets tricky. Employee number 3's weekly hours are 21. So 20 divided by 40 equals 52.5. Rounded to the nearest tenth, 0.5. That gives you a 0.5 FTE. So when you add those up, the total FTEs would be 2.4. Now, we also have a forgiveness calculator along with instructions that we'll be able to send to you and share with you. Since the calculation method tracks each employee by the hours they worked, and since it's the same method used pre-pandemic and during the 8-week period, it will fairly reflect the small business payroll costs and the hours worked without having to worry about whether an employee makes the cut as a full-time equivalent or if they're part-time. The Small Business Administration is also allowing for a simpler method that assigns 1.0 for employees who work 40 hours or more, and a zero point 0.5 who work fewer than 40 hours. While this may work for some small businesses, they can be some losers in this method, as you may have someone who worked 35 hours who is now being counted as a half of an FTE under the simple method that would have otherwise been included as 0.9. So what do you need for the documentation of these payroll costs? The application outlines what documentation, and the application is the one that we have available for you. It's out there on the Department of Labor and the SBA. The application outlines what documentation will be required with the forgiveness request that's going to have to go to your lender. For payroll costs, for example, the business outline, you have to outline these in the PPP Schedule A worksheet, and you must identify each employee that was paid during that 8-week period. Now remember, the business must also identify employees paid at an annualized rate below $100,000 in 2019 on one schedule, and that employees that were paid at an annualized rate over $100,000 on another schedule. The business owner's compensation is included on a separate line on the forgiveness application, but it still calculates into the application like any employee. And because of the per employee compensation restriction of $100,000, no employee or owner can have cash wage compensation that is forgiven greater than the annualized 8-week amount of $15,385. Consequently, the maximum cash compensation forgiven would have to be on the Schedule A, and a worksheet would be the $15,385. Now, note that this $15,385 cap does not include health insurance and retirement contributions paid by the business. The forgiveness application gives flexibility for small businesses who have a biweekly payroll, meaning every other week, such that they will be able to ensure that they can get 4 pay periods of 2 weeks into their 8-week period covered, regardless of when they receive their PPP loan funds and whether their regular biweekly payroll schedule hits. That was a very important question because some people said, I may not be able to get enough payrolls in depending upon when I get the money. And this was an important provision and instructions in the application, as many businesses were realizing that their payroll schedules weren't in sync, as I said, within the 8-week period of time. So to document the payroll costs, the SBA is requiring each of the following: bank accounts on third-party payroll service reports documenting the cash compensation paid to the employees. Bank accounts or third-party payroll service reports like paychecks and ADP, tax forms, or the equivalent third-party payroll service provider reports for the period that overlaps with the covered period or the alternative payroll period. For tax forms, the SBA is requesting the payroll tax form, usually the 941, which detail the Social Security and Medicare, which you may have already had to provide to them when you applied, and the state quarterly wage and unemployment filings. That's important because that's what allowed the states to know how much you actually were paying in the unemployment. And payment receipts, canceled checks, or account statements documenting the amount of employer contributions to employees' health insurance and retirement plans. Now, for some small businesses, there's going to be a significant lag from when their 8-week period will be up and when the small business will file its quarterly 941s. Because sometimes you may not file your 941s for maybe 4 to 6 weeks afterwards. It's not always done in the last payroll period of that quarter. It may be done by the end of the following month. So as a result, many small businesses will have to wait a month or two after the 8-week period before filing their forgiveness loan application. So don't be such a hurry. You're still going to be able to have it done. So for example, if your payroll protection program loan was funded on May 15th, for example, then your 8-week period will run into July and will be part of the second quarter, April through June, and the third quarter payroll reporting, July to September. This means you won't have to complete 941s to submit to your bank for the forgiveness until October. even though your 8-week period was up in July. We'll see. You have to see what flexibility the SBA is going to allow in this instance of the small businesses, and we're just going to have to wait till October. So it's unclear what documents a sole proprietor or partnership that doesn't have payroll and doesn't file the 941s. So how do you document your rent, mortgage, interest, and utilities? To document the approved non-payroll cost of rent, mortgage, interest, and utilities, the SBA is requiring existence of the existence of the obligation service prior to February 15th. Means, can you give me some proof of your debt service prior to August or February 15th, meaning evidence of payments during that 8-week period? So to document a business mortgage obligation, the business would provide the lender amortization schedules from your loan or your mortgage and a receipt of your payments, as well as statements from February 20th and during the 8-week period covered after you got the PPP. Now, to document rent or lease payments, a copy of your lease agreement is going to have to be produced from your landlord to show that it was actually in force prior to February 15th of 2020. And to document the payments, the small business owner is going to need to produce copies of account statements from its landlord or your lessor, showing the payments or canceled checks, evidencing the payments made during that same subsequent 8-week period of time. Small businesses who are paying rent monthly will generally be able to get the request 2 months worth of expenses during that 8-week period. The documentation required for utility payments is simple. It includes an invoice or statements from February 20th showing the utility service in place, and to document payments during that 8-week period of time, the business can use account statements, your invoices from your utility showing that the payments were made, canceled checks, or even bank statements showing that you made the payment. So small business owners are going to have to submit their forgiveness application and their supporting documentation to their bank, and their bank will have 60 days to approve or reject your forgiveness request. Attention to detail and a correctly completed forgiveness application is going to be key here to ensure the maximum amount forgivable. Understanding what's in the application now will greatly increase a small business's chance on requesting and receiving the maximum PPP loan forgiveness, and hopefully you'll be able to get all of what you received. There's still many unanswered questions, but seeing the PPP forgiveness loan application is a big step. Now, let me try and explain one last thing. People have said to me, Jay, what happens when I offer people their job back and they refuse or tell me they don't want to? This is a pandemic within a pandemic. And why does that happen? It happens for many reasons. Firstly, because they may be receiving more on unemployment benefits than if they were to return to work, and they choose not to come to work. So what I'm sharing with you, what you must do is send them a letter in writing, and I think you should do it, not by email, in writing, with a return receipt request or certified letter, with your full intent to bring them back to work, full or part-time, with their rate of pay, and tell them that you want to give them 5 days from the date of the letter or receipt of the letter. And if they don't sign for it, that was a refusal. And that if you don't receive that, or they don't tell you they're coming back, that their job will be terminated for job abandonment. Now, if they tell you they're not going to come back, it is also very important to share with them that they may be subject to loss of unemployment benefits, because if you're asked to verify unemployment from your office or your medical practice, you would actually have to legally say that they've refused employment and they're no longer working there. Now, how they might want to achieve family medical leave benefits for any number of the 3, 4, 5 reasons, that's another story. All right. But if you have that letter that you sent and that employee refused, you can use that letter as proof and use that money and apply for the loan forgiveness with the intent that you tried to bring them back and they refused. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's it. We look forward to providing you with additional information, and thank you for staying with me so I could explain the PPP. Thank you so much, and I appreciate your time.